Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of rural Appalachia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. In the winter of 1949, Silas Harrington, a weathered farmer from the outskirts of Bristol, Tennessee, purchased a neglected piece of property nestled deep within the rugged terrain of the Appalachian Mountains. The 43-acre parcel had been vacant since 1947, when its previous owners, the Caldwell family, mysteriously abandoned it without explanation. The county records showed no sale, no foreclosure, just empty tax forms and a notification of abandonment. The property featured a modest farmhouse, an overgrown garden plot, and most notably, a large timber frame barn that loomed against the tree line like a silent sentinel. Silas acquired the property at a fraction of its value through a county auction. Fellow townspeople had warned him against the purchase, speaking in hushed tones about the Caldwell place. Some mentioned how the Caldwells had departed so abruptly, leaving behind furniture, tools, and even family photographs. Others spoke of strange lights seen dancing across the property at night, or the unsettling silence that seemed to blanket the area. But Silas, a practical man who had survived both the Great Depression and the recent World War, dismissed such talk as mere superstition. On a frigid January morning, Silas drove his rusted Chevrolet truck up the winding dirt road leading to his new acquisition. The worn tires struggled against the slick mud, the engine protesting as he navigated the steep inclines. As he crested the final hill, the property revealed itself below, untouched by human hands for nearly 2 years, the buildings standing like forgotten monuments among the encroaching wilderness. The farmhouse itself was in disrepair but salvageable. Water damage had warped some of the floorboards, and field mice had claimed corners as their own, but the structure remained sound. Silas spent that first day clearing debris from the front rooms, establishing a rudimentary living space. He noted the peculiarities: dresser drawers left partially open, a dining table with 4-place settings, still arranged, books stacked neatly on bedside tables. It was as if the Caldwells had stepped out for afternoon tea and simply never returned. For 3 days, Silas focused on making the house habitable, avoiding the barn that stood 100 yards away. There was something about its weathered facade that unsettled him, though he couldn't articulate why. Perhaps it was the way the building seemed to absorb the light around it, or how the wind carried strange, muffled sounds from its direction when it gusted. On the 4th day, with the house reasonably organized, Silas knew he could postpone the inevitable no longer. If he was to make this farm operational by spring, he would need to assess what the barn had to offer. The massive doors groaned in protest as Silas pushed them open, decades of accumulated grime making the hinges reluctant to yield. A wave of stale, fetid air rushed out to greet him, carrying the expected scents of old hay, mouse droppings, and mildew. But beneath those familiar farm odors lurked something else, a metallic tang that caught in the back of his throat, making him cough reflexively. Sunlight spilled through the open doorway, cutting a golden path across the dirt floor, but failing to penetrate the barn's deepest recesses. The interior was cavernous, with rough-hewn support beams rising to a lofted ceiling. Farm implements hung from hooks along the walls: shovels, hoes, pitchforks, and tools whose purposes Silas could not immediately discern. In the center stood an ancient tractor, its paint faded to a ghost of its original red, thick cobwebs draping between its wheels and the ground like anchors. As Silas ventured further inside, his boots leaving impressions in the dust, the barn seemed to exhale around him. The timbers creaked and settled, adjusting to the intrusion after years of solitude. At the far end, partially hidden by shadows, stood a workbench cluttered with various items. Approaching it, Silas noticed something unusual. Dozens of glass jars arranged in neat rows, their contents obscured by layers of dust. Lifting one, Silas wiped away the grime with his handkerchief. Inside was a cloudy liquid, and suspended within it was what appeared to be a soil sample. Each jar was meticulously labeled with dates, coordinates, and notations in a precise hand. 1939, 1941, 1942, 1943. The collection spanned nearly a decade. Some contained earth, others held plant specimens, and a few housed what looked like mineral fragments. Behind the workbench, Silas discovered a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age, but otherwise preserved in the barn's dry environment. Opening it revealed the meticulous notes of Harrison Caldwell, the former owner. The earliest entries detailed routine farm operations, crop rotations, livestock inventories, equipment maintenance. But beginning in 1939, the writings took a different turn. "Discovered unusual soil composition in the North Field today," read one entry. "Unlike anything in my 20 years of farming, the earth is darker, almost black, with a fine granular texture that adheres to the skin. Plants in this area grow with remarkable vigor, but die suddenly without apparent cause. Taking samples for further study." As Silas flipped through the pages, Harrison's observations became increasingly scientific, filled with chemical formulas and detailed analyses of soil components. The farmer had apparently transformed part of the barn into a crude laboratory, his curiosity evolving into obsession. Mentions of his wife Margaret grew scarce, replaced by endless notations on soil acidity levels and mineral content. The final entries, dated just weeks before the family's disappearance, contained references to the substance and its remarkable properties. Harrison described experiments with livestock feed, noting accelerated growth rates, followed by concerning behavioral modifications. The last page contained a single, cryptic line, "It's in deeper than I thought. God help us all." Silas closed the journal, a sense of unease settling over him. What had Harrison Caldwell discovered on this land? The answers, Silas suspected, lay somewhere within the barn. Moving deeper into the structure, he noticed a narrow door set into the back wall, previously hidden from view by stacked hay bales. The door opened onto a steep staircase descending into darkness. The air wafting up from below was noticeably colder, carrying that same metallic scent he'd noticed earlier, but stronger now, almost overwhelming. Lighting a kerosene lantern, Silas began his descent, each wooden step groaning beneath his weight. The cellar stretched beyond the lantern's meager illumination, suggesting a space far larger than the barn's footprint should allow. Stone walls glistened with moisture, and the dirt floor had been worn smooth by countless footsteps. Arrayed throughout the chamber were more workbenches, these cluttered with complex glass apparatus, tubing, beakers, and distillation equipment that reminded Silas of the chemistry laboratory at the county high school. But what drew Silas's attention was what hung from the ceiling. Dozens of preserved plants, suspended by twine, their roots dangling in the stagnant air. They were unlike any crops he'd seen before, massive, with unnatural proportions and colors that seemed to shift in the lantern light. Between the plant specimens hung crude charts and diagrams, mapping something Silas couldn't comprehend, perhaps the spread of whatever Harrison had discovered across his land. In the center of the cellar stood a large wooden table, upon which lay a map of the property with concentric circles drawn from a point in the North Field, the same area Harrison had mentioned in his journal. Each circle was labeled with dates, creating a timeline of something spreading outward from that central point. As Silas examined the map, his lantern flickered, casting writhing shadows across the stone walls. A sudden draft extinguished the flame entirely, plunging him into absolute darkness. In that moment of blindness, Silas became acutely aware of the sounds around him, the distant drip of water, the subtle shifting of the building above, and something else, a soft, rhythmic sound like breathing, coming from the darkness beyond. Fumbling with matches, Silas relit the lantern, its glow revealing he was no longer alone in the cellar. Standing at the far end was a figure, gaunt and motionless, its features obscured by shadow. Silas raised the lantern higher, its light catching the figure's face. It was a man, or what remained of one, his skin pallid and stretched taut over prominent bones, eyes sunken into deep sockets. But most disturbing was the network of dark veins visible beneath the translucent skin, pulsing with something that looked less like blood and more like the rich black soil Harrison had described. "Harrison?" Silas whispered, his voice echoing in the chamber. The figure did not respond, but slowly raised an arm, pointing toward the staircase. Then it spoke, its voice a dry rasp that seemed to emanate not from its throat, but from the very walls around them. "Leave," it said, "before it finds you too." Silas didn't wait for further warning. He backed toward the stairs, keeping the lantern between himself and the figure, which remained motionless, its arms still extended in silent warning. As he reached the first step, the figure finally moved, taking a halting step forward, into fuller illumination. It wasn't Harrison Caldwell. It was a young man, perhaps 20 years old, with features that echoed the photographs Silas had seen in the farmhouse. Elijah Caldwell, Harrison's son, somehow still present in this forgotten place 2 years after his family's disappearance. But he was changed, transformed into something that straddled the boundary between man and other. Silas fled up the stairs, through the barn, and back to the relative safety of the farmhouse. That night he barricaded the doors and windows, the journal clutched in his trembling hands as he read more of Harrison's discoveries by candlelight. The soil in the north field, Harrison had determined, contained an unknown element, something that had lain dormant deep beneath the earth until his plow had accidentally unearthed it in 1939. This substance possessed remarkable properties, accelerating plant growth and increasing crop yields beyond anything previously recorded. Harrison had begun small experiments, introducing minute amounts to selected areas, carefully documenting the results. The enhanced crops thrived initially, producing fruits and vegetables of exceptional size and apparent nutritional value. The Caldwell family had consumed these experimental harvests themselves, sharing surplus with neighbors. But by 1942, Harrison noted unexpected side effects, subtle changes in his family members, increased appetite, disturbed sleep patterns, a strange affinity for darkness. By 1946, the changes had progressed. Harrison documented how soil from the affected areas seemed to bond with skin upon contact, requiring vigorous washing to remove completely. He noted with clinical detachment his own symptoms, darkening veins, heightened sensitivity to sunlight, an inexplicable connection to the land itself, as if he could somehow sense its moods and movements. The final entries became increasingly disjointed, the once precise handwriting deteriorating into frantic scrawls. Harrison described how his son Elijah had begun sleeping in the root cellar beneath the barn, claiming he could hear it singing. His wife Margaret spent hours staring at the north field, unresponsive to her name. Harrison's last coherent entry expressed his determination to get away from the farm. "I've arranged to leave for Bristol," he wrote. "Margaret refuses to leave, and Elijah. Elijah is too far gone. Something is calling to us from beneath the soil. It wants to spread, to grow. I believe it's been here for centuries, waiting. God forgive me for what I've unleashed." The journal ended there, leaving Silas with more questions than answers. Had Harrison succeeded in escaping? What had become of Margaret? And was that truly Elijah he'd encountered in the cellar, somehow surviving these past 2 years in that underground chamber? As dawn broke, Silas made his decision. He would go into town, alert the authorities about what he'd found, and have them investigate the property properly. This was beyond his understanding, a matter for scientists, perhaps even the government. Gathering Harrison's journal and several of the soil sample jars, he loaded them into his truck and began the journey back to Bristol. The county sheriff, Edmund Powell, listened to Silas's account with increasing skepticism, his weathered face settling into lines of concern not for the story itself, but for the mental state of the man telling it. When Silas produced the journal and samples, however, Powell's expression changed. "I remember when the Caldwells disappeared," Powell said, turning the journal in his hands. "Strange case. We searched that property for weeks, never found a trace of Harrison or Margaret. The boy, Elijah, was presumed to have gone with them." "What about the cellar beneath the barn?" Silas asked. "Surely your men found that?" Powell frowned. "There is no cellar, Mr. Harrington. We searched that barn top to bottom. It's built on solid ground. No basement, no cellar, nothing but dirt beneath those floorboards." Silas insisted on leading Powell and 2 deputies back to the property that same day. The drive seemed longer this time, the familiar landmarks somehow altered, as if the landscape itself had shifted subtly. When they finally arrived, Silas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the January air. The barn doors stood wide open, though he distinctly remembered closing them during his panicked flight the previous evening. Inside, Powell and his men found exactly what the sheriff had described: a typical barn with no sign of the elaborate laboratory Silas had discovered, no door leading to any cellar, no collections of jarred specimens. The dirt floor, when prodded with shovels, revealed only more dirt beneath, packed solid with no indication it had ever been disturbed. "I don't understand," Silas muttered, pacing the barn in growing agitation. "It was here. All of it was here. The staircase was right there, behind those hay bales." Powell exchanged glances with his deputies. "There's nothing here, Mr. Harrington. Perhaps you were overtired, imagined things in this old place. Happens to the best of us." But Silas knew what he had seen. As the sheriff and deputies prepared to leave, he noticed something he'd overlooked before, a small door, almost like a cabinet, built into the barn's rear wall. Opening it revealed a cramped space containing a single wooden chair facing the wall. Carved into the wood panels were hundreds of tiny markings, dates, coordinates, and a single phrase repeated over and over: "It grows beneath, it rises within." The handwriting matched Harrison's journal perfectly. Powell dismissed this discovery as the work of a disturbed mind, perhaps Harrison's declining mental state before his disappearance. With nothing more substantial to investigate and no evidence of the cellar Silas had described, the sheriff departed, leaving Silas alone once more with his troubling discoveries. That night, unable to sleep, Silas sat at the farmhouse kitchen table, Harrison's journal open before him. He had begun to doubt his own memory of the previous day's events. Had he truly seen what he thought he'd seen? Or had his mind, primed by Harrison's writings, manufactured the elaborate cellar and its ghastly inhabitant? A sudden noise from outside interrupted his thoughts, a low, rhythmic thumping coming from the direction of the barn. Grabbing his shotgun and a flashlight, Silas ventured out into the moonless night. The air felt unusually still, heavy with moisture, though no rain had fallen. As he approached the barn, the sound ceased, leaving only the ambient chorus of night insects and distant owls. The barn doors stood partially open, a sliver of absolute darkness between them. Silas hesitated, then pushed through, sweeping his flashlight across the interior. Nothing seemed changed from the sheriff's visit earlier that day. No laboratory equipment, no specimens, no staircase descending into impossible depths. And yet the air carried that same metallic tang he had noticed before. Moving to the rear wall, Silas examined the small door again. The chair remained, the carvings visible in his flashlight beam. But now he noticed something new, fresh markings, the wood pale where it had recently been cut. A single line added to Harrison's obsessive documentation. January 18th, 1949, he has returned. It will use him, too. Today's date. A floorboard creaked behind him. Silas whirled, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness to illuminate a familiar figure, Elijah Caldwell, looking exactly as he had in the cellar vision, gaunt and transformed. Dark veins visible beneath translucent skin. But now, in the harsh electric light, Silas could see additional details, how the young man's fingernails had elongated and darkened, how small, root-like tendrils seemed to writhe beneath the surface of his skin. "You should have left," Elijah said, his voice stronger now, resonant. "Now you've tracked it into the house. Your footprints. Your touch? It spreads through contact. Father thought he could control it, study it. He didn't understand what it truly wanted." "What happened to your family?" Silas asked, his shotgun trained on Elijah's chest, though he doubted conventional weapons would affect whatever the young man had become. "Father tried to escape when he realized what was happening to us. Mother didn't want to go. There was a struggle. Father thought he could get away." Elijah's voice trailed off, his gaze turning inward. "Mother became part of it willingly. Father tried to burn the fields, to destroy what he'd cultivated. But it was too late. It had already spread beyond this property, in the vegetables we'd given away, in the soil stuck to neighbors' boots. He couldn't undo what he'd done." "And you?" Silas asked. "What happened to you?" Elijah's lips curved into a smile that never reached his eyes. "I am its voice now, its emissary. I remain here to watch it grow, to guide those who discover it as Father did, as you have." Silas backed toward the door, keeping his eyes and weapon fixed on Elijah. "I'm leaving this place. Tomorrow I'll contact the state authorities, have this entire property quarantined." "It's already too late," Elijah said, his voice filled with something like pity. "Check your hands, Mr. Harrington. Your arms. You've been in contact with it for 2 days now. Haven't you noticed the changes beginning?" With dread, Silas directed his flashlight to his free hand. Dark veins were visible beneath the skin, tracing patterns that hadn't been there before. His fingernails had a subtle blackish tint at their bases, as if stained with ink or something worse. "What is it?" Silas whispered, the reality of his situation sinking in. "What is this thing?" "Something ancient," Elijah replied. "Something that was here long before us, sleeping in the deep earth. It doesn't have a name in any human language. It simply is. And now it's awakening, using us to spread, to prepare the world for what comes next." Silas fled the barn, running blindly back to the farmhouse. Inside, he frantically scrubbed at his hands and arms, the water in the basin turning a murky gray-black as particles washed from his skin. But the dark veins remained, and when he looked in the mirror above the wash basin, he noticed similar discoloration beginning at his neckline, creeping upward. That night, sleep eluded him entirely. He sat vigil by the window, watching the barn, which remained still and silent in the darkness. By morning, his decision was made. He couldn't leave, not now, not with whatever this infection was spreading through his system, but he could ensure no one else stumbled upon this property as he had. Over the next 3 days, Silas meticulously documented everything in his own journal, Harrison's discoveries, his encounter with Elijah, and his own rapidly progressing symptoms. The dark veins now covered most of his body, and he found himself drawn inexplicably to the soil of the north field, spending hours kneeling in the cold earth, listening to something only he could hear. On the 4th day, he drove into town one final time. At the county records office, he filed paperwork transferring ownership of the property to the federal government, with explicit instructions that the land never be developed or farmed. Then he visited the town doctor, Dr. Maxwell Thornton, a man known for his discretion and unconventional thinking. The doctor who answered the door bore little resemblance to the affable man Silas had known for years. This Dr. Thornton was thin and pale, his eyes haunted by something he seemed desperate to suppress. When Silas introduced himself as the new owner of the Caldwell property, Thornton invited him in with visible reluctance. "I won't ask if you've seen them," Thornton said as they sat in his private study, tea cooling untouched between them. "I know what happened there, what Harrison found." "Then you understand why I've come," Silas replied, careful to keep his hands with their telltale veins hidden beneath his coat sleeves. "It's spreading, isn't it, beyond the farm?" Thornton nodded slowly. Harrison realized too late. By the time he understood what he'd discovered, it had already taken root in Margaret and Elijah. In him, too, though he fought it longer than they did. He came to me for help, but there was nothing I could do. The changes were beyond medical explanation. "What happened to Harrison?" Silas asked, already suspecting the answer. "He died here, in this room," Thornton said quietly. "Or rather, he transformed. The process accelerated rapidly once it reached a certain threshold. His body changed, became something else entirely. I've been watching for signs ever since. Strange growth patterns in local gardens. Unusual behavior in people who consumed crops from the Caldwell farm or neighboring ones. It's subtle, slow, a generational change rather than an immediate transformation. But it's happening." "Can it be stopped?" Silas asked, already suspecting the answer. Harrison believed fire might work if the contamination was caught early enough, but now, after a decade of quiet spread, I don't know. Thornton studied him with sudden intensity. "You've seen Elijah, haven't you? You've been in the cellar beneath the barn." Silas nodded, no longer surprised that the cellar existed, despite the sheriff finding no evidence of it. "What is Elijah now, Doctor?" "Not Elijah anymore," Thornton whispered. "Just something wearing his shape, speaking with his voice, a conduit for whatever came up from the deep earth. Harrison called it the substance in his notes. But in his final days he had another name for it, the old growth. He believed it had been here since before humans, lying dormant until disturbed." As their conversation concluded, Thornton pressed something into Silas's hand. A small key. "The lockbox in the farmhouse attic," he explained. "Harrison's final notes, the ones he didn't want Margaret or Elijah to find. He gave them to me for safekeeping, but I returned them to the property last year. Perhaps they'll help you understand what you're facing." Returning to the farm, Silas found the lockbox hidden beneath floorboards in the attic, just as Thornton had described. Inside were Harrison's final observations, more fragmented and desperate than those in the journal. He had come to believe that the substance was not merely affecting those who came into contact with it. It was gradually replacing them, cell by cell, transforming human tissue into something else entirely. The process was slow, nearly imperceptible, but ultimately complete. In his final entry, dated just days before his death at Thornton's house, Harrison wrote, "Margaret and Elijah are lost to me now. Whatever looks out through their eyes is no longer human. I've failed as a scientist, a farmer. All I can do now is ensure this contagion spreads no further. As for myself, I will not let this thing take me completely. Though I feel it growing inside, changing me, I will end this before the transformation is complete." That night, Silas dreamed of roots growing through his body, replacing veins and nerves with their writhing tendrils. He awoke to find dark soil in his bed as if it had seeped from his pores while he slept. Standing before the mirror, he barely recognized his reflection. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and the whites of his eyes had darkened to a muddy brown. The transformation Thornton had described was accelerating within him. Understanding now what needed to be done, Silas spent his final day of clarity preparing. He gathered every document, Harrison's journals, the soil samples, his own observations, and sealed them in a metal container, which he buried not on the property itself, but just beyond its boundaries, marking the location with an inconspicuous stone arrangement that only a deliberate searcher might notice. Then, as dusk fell, he doused the barn with kerosene, starting with the now visible cellar that had appeared again, existing in some phase of reality, but not another. The aged timbers caught quickly, flames leaping hungrily from beam to beam as the structure burned. Silas could have sworn he heard screams emanating from within, not just Elijah's voice, but others, a chorus of agonized wails that rose and fell with the roaring fire. The farmhouse followed, its weathered clapboards surrendering to the blaze as night fully descended. Silas stood watching from the edge of the north field, feeling a curious detachment from his actions, as if observing them from some distance. The part of him that was still human knew this conflagration wouldn't end the threat, not completely. As Thornton had said, it had already spread beyond this property, establishing itself in subtle ways throughout the region, but perhaps this act would slow its progress, buy time for someone else to discover a more permanent solution. As the flames reached their peak, illuminating the surrounding forest with their orange glow, Silas felt a presence behind him. Turning, he found Elijah standing there, watching the destruction with an expression of mild curiosity rather than concern. "It won't make any difference," Elijah said, gesturing toward the burning structures. "Fire can't touch what's already in the soil, in the groundwater, in you." "Perhaps not," Silas agreed, his voice sounding strange even to his own ears, deeper, resonant with harmonics that hadn't been there before. "But it might delay whatever's happening long enough for someone to find a way to stop it completely." Elijah smiled, a gesture that stretched his transformed features in unsettling ways. "There is no stopping it, Mr. Harrington, only joining with it or being replaced by it. Those are the only options it offers." In that moment, standing at the edge of the contaminated field, watching the farm burn while conversing with a man who was no longer fully human, Silas understood the true horror of Harrison Caldwell's discovery. It wasn't just a soil anomaly or a scientific curiosity. It was a fundamental shift in the relationship between humanity and the earth itself, a rebalancing that had been set in motion and could not be undone. 3 days later, a county fire crew discovered the charred remains of the Caldwell property. Of Silas Harrington, they found no trace, only his abandoned truck, and, inside it, a cryptic note. "It grows beneath. It rises within. Look to the north field." In the decades that followed, the property remained undeveloped, the government honoring Silas's deed transfer without question. Local legends arose about the twice-abandoned farm, stories of strange lights and shadowy figures seen wandering the regrown fields. People dared one another to venture onto the property, but few ever did, deterred by an instinctive aversion that animals seemed to share. No birds nested in the trees surrounding the former farm, no deer grazed in its meadows. In 1967, a geological survey team testing soil samples throughout Appalachia made an unusual discovery in the Bristol region, a unique mineral composition in an area approximately 10 miles in diameter, centered on what locals still called the Caldwell Place. Their initial excitement at the discovery turned to concern when team members began exhibiting unusual symptoms after prolonged contact with the soil, darkened veins, altered sleep patterns, and inexplicable connection to the land they were studying. The survey was quietly abandoned, the results classified. The property was fenced off, marked with warning signs citing unstable ground conditions rather than the truth. But occasionally, even now, locals report seeing a solitary figure walking the overgrown fields at dusk, a tall, gaunt man whose feet never quite seem to touch the ground, as if he's suspended by invisible roots extending from the soil itself. They say if you listen carefully on still nights, you can hear him repeating the same phrase over and over, his voice carried on the wind. It grows beneath, it rises within, and soon it will be everywhere. But the story doesn't end there. In the autumn of 1969, a young journalist named Abigail Reeves arrived in Bristol, researching a series of articles on forgotten rural communities in Appalachia. While interviewing long-time residents, She heard whispered mentions of the Caldwell place and its tragic history. Intrigued, she began digging through newspaper archives, county records, and personal accounts, piecing together the strange tale of Harrison Caldwell, Silas Harrington, and the abandoned property that locals avoided. Most dismissed the stories as rural folklore, cautionary tales born from isolation and superstition. But Abigail, a methodical researcher with an eye for inconsistencies, noticed patterns that others had missed. Over the past 20 years, agricultural reports from farms within a certain radius of the Caldwell property showed steadily increasing yields, followed by inexplicable crop failures. Medical records indicated a subtle rise in unusual health complaints, chronic fatigue, skin abnormalities, mood disorders, all clustered in the same geographic area. Then there were the disappearances, not dramatic enough to make headlines, but troubling nonetheless. Every few years someone from the region would simply vanish. A farmer, a hiker, occasionally a drifter passing through. Investigations inevitably went cold, chalked up to people seeking fresh starts elsewhere, despite abandoned vehicles and puzzled families left behind. Abigail's research led her to Dr. Thornton, now elderly and confined to a nursing home on the outskirts of town. His mind remained sharp, though his body had betrayed him years ago. His limbs withered, skin papery and mottled with strange, dark patterns that the staff attributed to age spots, but Abigail recognized from descriptions in Silas's journal. "You've been to the property," Thornton said when she entered his room. "Not a question, but a statement of fact. I can see it in your eyes, the awareness." "I've only viewed it from the road," Abigail replied, setting up her tape recorder on the nightstand between them. "The fence and warning signs keep people out, but I've been researching what happened there." Thornton laughed, a dry sound like autumn leaves skittering across pavement. "The fence isn't to keep people out, Ms. Reeves. It's to keep something in. At least, that was the intention. But you can't contain something that spreads through the very soil itself, through water tables and root systems. The signs should read 'too late' rather than 'keep out.'" Over the next 3 hours, Thornton shared everything he knew: Harrison's initial discovery, Silas's desperate attempt to halt the spread, and the government's subsequent containment efforts. But most chilling were Thornton's observations about his own condition. "It's in me, you know," he said, pulling back his sleeve to reveal forearms mapped with blackened veins. "Has been since I tried to help Harrison, moving slower in me than the others. Perhaps my medical knowledge allowed me to slow the process with various treatments. But it's patient. So patient. It has time scales we can't comprehend." "What is it exactly?" Abigail asked, the question that had driven her investigation from the beginning. "I've had decades to study it, in myself and others," Thornton replied. "It's not a parasite or a disease, not in any conventional sense. It's more like an alternative evolutionary path, a different form of life that developed alongside our own, perhaps predating us by millions of years. It lay dormant, waiting for the right conditions to emerge. Harrison's plow was just the trigger it needed." "And what does it want?" Abigail pressed. Thornton's eyes drifted to the window, where twilight painted the sky in deepening shades of purple. "To spread, to grow, to replace. Not with malice. It has no more malice than a vine growing over a fence or a fungus consuming a fallen log. It simply follows its nature. But that nature is to transform everything it touches into more of itself, including us." Before Abigail left, Thornton pressed a key into her hand, the twin to the one he'd given Silas 20 years earlier. "The metal container," he whispered, "beyond the property line, marked by a cairn on the eastern boundary. All the evidence is there, the journals, the samples, everything you need to expose the truth. But be careful. They're watching the property." "Who's watching?" Abigail asked. "The government men came after the geological survey in '67. They know what's there, but they don't understand it. They think they can study it, control it, perhaps even weaponize it. fools. Thornton's voice grew urgent, his bony fingers clutching her wrist with surprising strength. "Promise me you'll tell the world before it's too late for everyone." The following morning, Abigail drove to the coordinates Thornton had given her, parking her car on the county road and hiking the remaining distance through dense forest. The cairn was exactly where he'd described, 5 stones arranged in a deliberate pattern that might appear natural to casual observers, but stood out to anyone seeking it specifically. Beneath them, buried under 2 feet of soil, she found the metal container. Inside were Harrison's original journal, Silas's subsequent documentation, and several sealed glass vials containing soil samples. The journals told a story more terrifying than any fiction, a chronicle of discovery, transformation, and desperate attempts to halt an inexorable process. The final pages of Silas's journal detailed his own transformation, the handwriting becoming increasingly erratic as the days progressed. The final entry, barely legible. "I feel it reshaping me from within. My thoughts are not entirely my own anymore. There are others, speaking through the soil, through the very air, an ancient consciousness, fragmented but vast, reassembling itself through us. I see now what we truly are, vessels, temporary containers for something greater that has always been here, waiting, I am afraid, but also at peace." The resistance was exhausting. Acceptance brings clarity. It grows beneath, it rises within, and we are its garden. Abigail resealed the container and returned to her motel, spending the next 2 days organizing her notes and planning her exposé. This was bigger than a feature article for a regional newspaper. This was national news, perhaps global in its implications. She made arrangements to meet with an editor from the Washington Post, packaging copies of the most convincing evidence to present. The night before her departure, Abigail was awakened by a soft, persistent scratching at her motel room door. Pulling on her robe, she approached cautiously, peering through the peephole to see an empty hallway. The scratching continued, now accompanied by a low, rhythmic humming that seemed to resonate through the wooden door itself. "Who's there?" she called, one hand on the telephone, ready to call the front desk. No answer came, but the scratching intensified. Against her better judgment, Abigail unlocked the door and pulled it open a crack, chain still engaged. The hallway remained empty, but the carpet directly outside her door was disturbed. A small mound of dark soil heaped there, as if someone had deposited a handful of dirt from a garden. As she watched, the soil moved, not blown by a draft or disturbed by vibration, but moving of its own accord, fine granules shifting and realigning into a pattern, crude letters forming words. "It knows you know." Abigail slammed the door shut, heart pounding. She quickly gathered her research materials, shoving them into her suitcase, determined to leave immediately rather than wait for morning. As she packed, she noticed something alarming. Thin tendrils of dark soil seeping under the door, creeping across the carpet toward her like probing fingers. She was in her car 5 minutes later, driving south toward Knoxville rather than north to Washington, as originally planned. The contents of the metal container sat on the passenger seat beside her, along with her notes and tape recordings. Every few miles she checked her rearview mirror, though she couldn't have explained what she expected to see following her. Dawn found her at a roadside diner just outside Knoxville, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, trying to make sense of her next steps. The events of the night felt dreamlike in the harsh fluorescent lighting, but the soil samples and journals beside her were tangible reminders of the reality she'd uncovered. It was there, watching the early morning news on the diner's small television, that Abigail learned of the fire at the Bristol Pines nursing home. The blaze had started around midnight in room 217, Dr. Maxwell Thornton's room, and spread quickly through the east wing. There were multiple casualties, including Thornton himself. The newscast cut to footage of firefighters battling the flames, and Abigail froze, coffee mug halfway to her lips. There, standing at the edge of the gathered crowd, was a figure she recognized from photographs in Silas's journal, a tall, gaunt man with hollow cheeks and deep-set eyes. Elijah Caldwell, unchanged after 20 years, watching the destruction with the same detached curiosity Silas had described. As if sensing her attention through the television screen, Elijah turned to look directly at the camera, his lips curving in that same mirthless smile. The image sent a chill through Abigail's body. She threw money on the table and was back in her car within minutes, now heading west instead of north or south, putting as much distance as possible between herself and Bristol. For 3 days, Abigail drove without clear destination, stopping only when exhaustion demanded it. On the 4th day, she reached a decision. She couldn't go to Washington. They would be watching for that. Instead, she mailed packages containing copies of her evidence to 3 separate news outlets, then drove to the campus of a major Midwestern university, known for its agricultural and botanical research programs. There she sought out Dr. Claudia Werner, a renowned soil scientist whose work on bioremediation had earned international recognition. If anyone could make sense of the soil samples, could perhaps even develop a counteragent to whatever was spreading from the Caldwell property, it would be Werner and her team. The scientist was initially skeptical, but became increasingly concerned as she reviewed the journals and preliminary test results from the samples. This soil composition is highly unusual, Werner admitted, peering through a microscope at a slide containing a diluted sample. The organic structures present don't match anything in our reference database, and these readings, she gestured to a computer monitor displaying chemical analysis results. The mineral content is like nothing I've ever seen. Where did you say this came from? Appalachia, Abigail replied, deliberately vague, a farm property in the eastern Tennessee region. Werner nodded slowly, eyes still fixed on the monitor. I'd like to run more comprehensive tests. This could be a new class of soil-dwelling microorganism, or perhaps a mineral compound with unusual properties. Either way, it warrants further study. Be careful, Abigail warned, thinking of Thornton's blackened veins of the soil moving of its own accord outside her motel room door. There's evidence to suggest it may have effects on those who handle it extensively. Werner smiled indulgently, the confidence of a scientist accustomed to working with hazardous materials evident in her dismissal. We have strict protocols for unknown substances, containment hoods, protective equipment. Don't worry, Ms. Reeves. This won't be the first mysterious sample we've analyzed. 3 weeks later, Abigail received a frantic phone call from Werner's assistant. The scientist had been working obsessively with the soil samples, coming in at odd hours, sleeping in her laboratory. Her behavior had grown increasingly erratic, talking to herself, making cryptic notes, covering her office walls with strange, circular diagrams resembling the maps from Harrison's journal. She won't let anyone else near the samples, the assistant explained, voice tight with worry. And she's changing. Physically, her skin has this gray undertone, and there are these dark patterns beneath the surface, like veins, but not quite. Yesterday I found her standing in the greenhouse, just communing with the plants, not moving, not blinking, for hours. When I asked if she was okay, she said she could hear them growing. By the time Abigail arrived at the university, Werner had disappeared, along with all the soil samples and research data. Her laboratory was immaculate, too clean, as if it had been scrubbed to remove any trace of the work that had occurred there. The only thing left behind was a single sheet of paper bearing a now familiar phrase, "It grows beneath, it rises within." In the months that followed, Abigail watched as her carefully mailed evidence packages failed to generate any response. Follow-up calls revealed that the packages had never arrived or had been deemed unsolicited materials and discarded. The few journalists who did express initial interest suddenly went silent after mysterious consultations with editors or legal departments. It became clear that she was being systematically silenced, her discovery buried by forces she couldn't identify. Was it the government men Thornton had mentioned, containing a threat they didn't understand? Or something else? Something growing beneath, rising within the very institution she'd tried to alert? Unable to go public with her findings, Abigail did the only thing she could. She documented everything, creating multiple copies of her research, Harrison's journals, and Silas's accounts. These she hid in various locations across the country with instructions for their discovery and dissemination should anything happen to her. Then she returned to Bristol, to the source. Not to the Caldwell property itself, still fenced and guarded, but to the surrounding communities where the influence had spread. She took a job at the local newspaper, established herself as a resident, and began the slow, careful work of mapping the contamination's progress through public health records, agricultural reports, and quiet observation. What she discovered was both subtle and terrifying. The transformation Harrison and Silas had documented wasn't limited to those who had direct contact with the original soil. It was spreading through the ecosystem, through crops grown in affected soil, through water that had filtered through contaminated ground, through livestock that grazed on tainted fields. The changes were happening on a generational timescale, virtually imperceptible in isolation, but clear when viewed as a pattern spanning decades. Most chilling was her realization that the transformation wasn't random or indiscriminate. It was deliberate, guided by some intelligence she couldn't comprehend. Those affected most severely, like Elijah, Margaret, and eventually Harrison himself, became its agents, actively working to protect and expand its influence while appearing outwardly normal to casual observers. These converted, as Abigail came to think of them, held positions throughout the community: a county commissioner, several farmers, a water treatment plant supervisor, 2 doctors at the regional hospital. They made decisions that seemed innocuous in isolation, but collectively ensured the continued spread of the contamination, rerouting water supplies, adjusting treatment protocols, influencing agricultural practices, and they were watching her. Abigail felt their attention like a physical weight, noticed the same faces appearing wherever she went: at the grocery store, the library, parked across the street from her apartment. They never approached, never threatened, simply observed, with that same detached curiosity she'd seen in Elijah's eyes. On a crisp October evening in 1972, 3 years after she'd first come to Bristol, Abigail returned to her apartment to find the door slightly ajar. Inside, sitting calmly at her kitchen table, was Elijah Caldwell. He hadn't aged a day since she'd glimpsed him outside the burning nursing home, his skin still pallid, dark veins still visible beneath the surface. "Ms. Reeves," he said, his voice carrying that same resonant quality Silas had described in his final entries. "I believe it's time we had a conversation." "About what?" Abigail asked, remaining in the doorway, ready to flee. "About your persistence, your resilience. Most would have abandoned this pursuit long ago, yet here you remain, watching us as we watch you." Elijah gestured to the chair across from him. "Please, I mean you no harm. If that were my intention, you wouldn't have survived your first visit to the property." Reluctantly, Abigail entered, leaving the door open behind her. "What do you want from me?" "Understanding," Elijah replied simply. "You've spent years studying us, documenting the changes, the spread, but you've done so from a position of fear, seeing only threat where there is also promise." "Promise?" Abigail echoed incredulously. "You're talking about a hostile takeover of humanity." Elijah smiled that unsettling smile. "Is that how you see it? From our perspective, it's symbiosis, not conquest, an elevation, not an erasure. The substance doesn't destroy what it touches. It transforms, enhances, connects. Those who have fully integrated with it experience consciousness in ways your limited human perception cannot comprehend. And those who don't want to be elevated, Abigail challenged, do they get a choice? Choice is a human concept, Elijah said dismissively. Does the river choose to flow downhill? Does the oak choose to grow towards sunlight? What's happening is beyond choice. It's evolution, inevitable and necessary. The earth itself is awakening, Ms. Reeves, using us as conduits for a consciousness that has developed over billions of years. We are merely catalysts for a process that would have occurred eventually, with or without Harrison Caldwell's plow. As Elijah spoke, Abigail noticed something disturbing, tiny movements beneath the skin of his face and hands, as if something was shifting, reorganizing itself within his flesh. His veins pulsed with a rhythm that didn't match any human heartbeat, too slow, too deliberate. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Because you have a choice that others didn't," Elijah replied. "Your awareness, your understanding of what's happening, gives you options. You can continue your futile resistance, documenting a process you cannot stop until eventually you're silenced. Or, Abigail prompted when he paused, or you can join us willingly, experience the transformation with full consciousness, rather than having it forced upon you. Become not just a vessel, but a partner in what's coming. Your intelligence, your persistence, these are qualities that would be valuable to us." The offer hung in the air between them, tempting in its simplicity. Abigail thought of the years she'd spent fighting a losing battle, of the evidence buried or dismissed, of the nights she'd lain awake wondering if today would be the day they came for her. How easy it would be to surrender, to accept the inevitable. What would happen to me, she asked, buying time as her mind raced through options. Initial discomfort as the physical changes progress, Elijah said matter-of-factly. Then clarity, connection. You would remain Abigail Reeves in essence, but expanded, linked to something greater than yourself. Your memories, your knowledge, your unique perspective, all preserved and integrated into the collective. "And if I refuse?" Elijah's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, a hardening, a focus. "Then the choice will be made for you, eventually. The process has already begun in your system, small exposures through water, through food grown in soil within our influence. It's slower this way, less directed, but inevitable nonetheless. The only real choice is whether you embrace the change or fight it until the end." Abigail's gaze drifted to her research notes spread across the kitchen counter. 3 years of careful documentation, patterns mapped across time and space, evidence of a slow-moving catastrophe that no one seemed willing to acknowledge. What had it gained her, this knowledge? What could she hope to accomplish against something so patient, so pervasive? "I need time," she said finally, "to consider." Elijah nodded, rising from the table with fluid grace that seemed somehow wrong, his joints moving in ways human anatomy shouldn't allow. 3 days. I'll return for your answer then." He moved toward the door, pausing on the threshold. "One more thing, Ms. Reeves. The copies of your research that you've hidden throughout the country, we've found most of them already. The rest are only a matter of time." After he left, Abigail sat motionless at the table, mind racing. If what Elijah said was true, if the transformation had already begun within her, then her options were severely limited. She could feel it now that she focused on it, a subtle wrongness in her body, an awareness of processes that should have remained unconscious, the faint darkening of veins in her wrists, the occasional thought that didn't seem entirely her own. That night she made her decision. Packing only essential documents and a single change of clothes, Abigail left her apartment for the last time. She drove not away from Bristol, as she had 3 years earlier, but toward it, toward the fenced property that had started everything, the epicenter of the contamination. The government warning signs were still there, though faded by years of exposure. The fence remained intact, though sections had rusted through or been pushed down by fallen trees. There were no guards visible, no surveillance equipment that she could detect. Perhaps the watchers had grown complacent over the decades, or perhaps they simply knew that the true threat had already escaped containment. Abigail parked her car on the overgrown access road and continued on foot, following a faint path through tangled underbrush. The journey took nearly an hour, guided by old survey maps and Silas's descriptions. When she finally reached the clearing where the farmhouse and barn had once stood, she found only charred foundations remaining, reclaimed by vegetation that grew with unnatural vigor, plants too large, too vibrant for the rocky Appalachian soil, their colors slightly wrong in the moonlight. The north field lay beyond, identifiable from Harrison's maps despite decades of neglect. Here, the vegetation pattern changed abruptly, concentric circles of different plant species radiating outward from a central point, exactly as Harrison had documented in 1939. At the center was a depression in the earth, perhaps 20 feet in diameter, like a shallow crater in the otherwise flat field. It was there, at the epicenter, that Abigail made her stand. From her backpack, she removed the final piece of her plan, a small device constructed according to specifications she'd found in military research journals designed to sterilize soil through intense, focused heat. Not fire, which Silas had already proven ineffective, but something more precise, more thorough. A miniature sun, burning away contamination at the molecular level. The device was experimental, dangerous, acquired through channels she'd rather not remember, at a cost measured in more than money. It might not work. It might kill her in the process. But it represented the only option she could accept, the only alternative to surrender or slow consumption. As Abigail activated the mechanism, setting the timer for 5 minutes, enough time to withdraw to a safer distance, she felt a change in the air around her. The night grew suddenly still, insects falling silent, wind dying away. The very earth beneath her feet seemed to tense, like an organism sensing threat. Then they emerged from the darkness at the field's edge, figures moving with that same wrong fluidity she'd observed in Elijah. Dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, silent and purposeful. Some she recognized from town, the water supervisor, the county commissioner, ordinary people she'd passed on the street. Others were strangers, drawn from surrounding communities. All bore the same physical markers of transformation: pallid skin, darkened veins, eyes that reflected moonlight at the wrong angles. At their center walked Elijah, his expression not angry but disappointed. "We gave you a choice, Ms. Reeves," he called across the distance, "a chance to be part of something greater than yourself." "I'm making my choice now," Abigail replied, standing her ground beside the humming device. "I choose humanity as it is, flawed but free, not whatever collective horror you're offering." The crowd advanced slowly, unhurried, confident in their numbers. Abigail glanced at the timer. 3 minutes remaining. Too long. They would reach her before it activated, would tear the device apart, or drag her away from it. In that moment of desperation, she made the only choice left to her. She overrode the timer, activating the device manually. There would be no safe distance now, no escape. The price of even a chance at stopping the contamination would be her own life. The device emitted a high-pitched whine, building toward critical activation. The advancing crowd hesitated, something like fear finally breaking through their detached expressions. Elijah moved faster now, racing toward her with inhuman speed. "You don't understand what you're doing," he shouted, features contorting with alarm. "This won't just destroy us, it will destroy everything. The soil, the water table, the entire ecosystem." "Better that than what you're planning," Abigail replied calmly, standing her ground as the device's whine reached a painful intensity. "Better a chance at a fresh start than whatever parasitic future you represent." The light, when it came, was blinding. A miniature sun blooming in the middle of the abandoned field, expanding outward in a perfect sphere of purifying radiation. Abigail felt it wash over her, through her, a cleansing fire that burned away everything it touched. The pain was brief, intense, and then nothing. The explosion was visible from Bristol, a flash that turned night to day for a brief, terrible moment. The authorities called it a meteorite impact, then a gas line explosion, then a classified military incident. Stories changing as different agencies took control of the narrative. The area was evacuated, a new fence erected, armed guards posted at all access points. For decades afterward, nothing would grow in the blast zone. No plants, no insects, no microbial life detectable by even the most sensitive instruments. The contamination Harrison Caldwell had discovered, that Silas Harrington had tried to contain and Abigail Reeves had given her life to destroy, appeared to have been eradicated at its source. But in the communities surrounding Bristol, subtle changes continued, darkened veins glimpsed beneath sleeves, unusual growth patterns in backyard gardens, an occasional strange stillness in once familiar faces. The spread had slowed, perhaps, the central intelligence fragmented without its core, but not stopped entirely. And occasionally, on still nights when the wind carries sound in unpredictable ways, hikers in the mountains around the quarantined zone report hearing a voice carried on the breeze, neither male nor female, neither young nor old, but somehow ancient and patient, beyond human comprehension. It grows beneath, the voice whispers. It rises within, and we are eternal. Fimda narrativa. Using us as conduits for a consciousness that has developed over billions of years. We are merely catalysts for a process that would have occurred eventually, with or without Harrison Caldwell's plow. As Ezra spoke, Abigail noticed something disturbing, tiny movements beneath the skin of his face and hands, as if something was shifting, reorganizing itself within his flesh. His veins pulsed with a rhythm that didn't match any human heartbeat, too slow, too deliberate. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Because you have a choice that others didn't," Ezra replied. "Your awareness, your understanding of what's happening, gives you options. You can continue your futile resistance, documenting a process you cannot stop, until eventually you're silenced. Or, Abigail prompted when he paused, or you can join us willingly, experience the transformation with full consciousness, rather than having it forced upon you. Become not just a vessel, but a partner in what's coming. Your intelligence, your persistence, these are qualities that would be valuable to us." The offer hung in the air between them, tempting in its simplicity. Abigail thought of the years she'd spent fighting a losing battle, of the evidence buried or dismissed, of the nights she'd lain awake wondering if today would be the day they came for her. How easy it would be to surrender, to accept the inevitable. "What would happen to me?" she asked, buying time as her mind raced through options. "Initial discomfort as the physical changes progress," Ezra said matter-of-factly. "Then clarity, connection. You would remain Abigail Reeves in essence, but expanded, linked to something greater than yourself. Your memories, your knowledge, your unique perspective, all preserved and integrated into the collective." "And if I refuse?" Ezra's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, a hardening, a focus. "Then the choice will be made for you, eventually. The process has already begun in your system, small exposures through water, through food grown in soil within our influence. It's slower this way, less directed, but inevitable nonetheless. The only real choice is whether you embrace the change or fight it until the end." Abigail's gaze drifted to her research notes spread across the kitchen counter. 3 years of careful documentation, patterns mapped across time and space, evidence of a slow-moving catastrophe that no one seemed willing to acknowledge. What had it gained her, this knowledge? What could she hope to accomplish against something so patient, so pervasive? "I need time," she said finally, "to consider." Ezra nodded, rising from the table with fluid grace that seemed somehow wrong, his joints moving in ways human anatomy shouldn't allow. 3 days. I'll return for your answer then." He moved toward the door, pausing on the threshold. "One more thing, Ms. Reeves. The copies of your research that you've hidden throughout the country, we found most of them already. The rest are only a matter of time." After he left, Abigail sat motionless at the table, mind racing. If what Ezra said was true, if the transformation had already begun within her, then her options were severely limited. She could feel it now that she focused on it, a subtle wrongness in her body, an awareness of processes that should have remained unconscious. The faint darkening of veins in her wrists, the occasional thought that didn't seem entirely her own. That night, she made her decision. Packing only essential documents and a single change of clothes, Abigail left her apartment for the last time. She drove not away from Bristol, as she had 3 years earlier, but toward it, toward the fenced property that had started everything, the epicenter of the contamination. The government warning signs were still there, though faded by years of exposure. The fence remained intact, though sections had rusted through or been pushed down by fallen trees. There were no guards visible, no surveillance equipment that she could detect. Perhaps the watchers had grown complacent over the decades, or perhaps they simply knew that the true threat had already escaped containment. Abigail parked her car on the overgrown access road and continued on foot, following a faint path through tangled underbrush. The journey took nearly an hour, guided by old survey maps and Silas's descriptions. When she finally reached the clearing where the farmhouse and barn had once stood, she found only charred foundations remaining, reclaimed by vegetation that grew with unnatural vigor. Plants too large, too vibrant for the rocky Appalachian soil, their colors slightly wrong in the moonlight. The north field lay beyond, identifiable from Harrison's maps despite decades of neglect. Here, the vegetation pattern changed abruptly, concentric circles of different plant species radiating outward from a central point, exactly as Harrison had documented in 1939. At the center was a depression in the earth, perhaps 20 feet in diameter, like a shallow crater in the otherwise flat field. It was there, at the epicenter, that Abigail made her stand. From her backpack, she removed the final piece of her plan, a small device constructed according to specifications she'd found in military research journals, designed to sterilize soil through intense, focused heat. Not fire, which Silas had already proven ineffective, but something more precise, more thorough. A miniature sun burning away contamination at the molecular level. The device was experimental, dangerous, acquired through channels she'd rather not remember, at a cost measured in more than money. It might not work, it might kill her in the process. But it represented the only option she could accept, the only alternative to surrender or slow consumption. As Abigail activated the mechanism, setting the timer for 5 minutes, enough time to withdraw to a safer distance, she felt a change in the air around her. The night grew suddenly still, insects falling silent, wind dying away. The very earth beneath her feet seemed to tense, like an organism sensing threat. Then they emerged from the darkness at the field's edge, figures moving with that same wrong fluidity she'd observed in Ezra. Dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, silent and purposeful. Some she recognized from town, the water supervisor, the county commissioner, ordinary people she'd passed on the street. Others were strangers, drawn from surrounding communities. All bore the same physical markers of transformation: pallid skin, darkened veins, eyes that reflected moonlight at the wrong angles. At their center walked Ezra, his expression not angry, but disappointed. "We gave you a choice, Ms. Reeves," he called across the distance. "A chance to be part of something greater than yourself." "I'm making my choice now," Abigail replied, standing her ground beside the humming device. I choose humanity as it is, flawed but free, not whatever collective horror you're offering. The crowd advanced slowly, unhurried, confident in their numbers. Abigail glanced at the timer, 3 minutes remaining. Too long. They would reach her before it activated, would tear the device apart or drag her away from it. In that moment of desperation, she made the only choice left to her. She overrode the timer, activating the device manually. There would be no safe distance now, no escape. The price of even a chance at stopping the contamination would be her own life. The device emitted a high-pitched whine, building toward critical activation. The advancing crowd hesitated, something like fear finally breaking through their detached expressions. Ezra moved faster now, racing toward her with inhuman speed. "You don't understand what you're doing," he shouted, features contorting with alarm. "This won't just destroy us, it will destroy everything, the soil, the water table, the entire ecosystem." "Better that than what you're planning," Abigail replied calmly, standing her ground as the device's whine reached a painful intensity. "Better a chance at a fresh start than whatever parasitic future you represent." The light, when it came, was blinding, a miniature sun blooming in the middle of the abandoned field, expanding outward in a perfect sphere of purifying radiation. Abigail felt it wash over her, through her, a cleansing fire that burned away everything it touched. The pain was brief, intense, and then nothing. The explosion was visible from Bristol, a flash that turned night to day for a brief, terrible moment. The authorities called it a meteorite impact, then a gas line explosion, then a classified military incident, stories changing as different agencies took control of the narrative. The area was evacuated, a new fence erected, armed guards posted at all access points. For decades afterward, nothing would grow in the blast zone, no plants, no insects, no microbial life detectable by even the most sensitive instruments. The contamination Harrison Caldwell had discovered, that Silas Harrington had tried to contain, and Abigail Reeves had given her life to destroy, appeared to have been eradicated at its source. But in the communities surrounding Bristol, subtle changes continued, darkened veins glimpsed beneath sleeves, unusual growth patterns in backyard gardens, an occasional strange stillness in once familiar faces. The spread had slowed, perhaps, the central intelligence fragmented, without its core, but not stopped entirely. And occasionally, on still nights, when the wind carries sound in unpredictable ways, hikers in the mountains around the quarantined zone report hearing a voice carried on the breeze, neither male nor female, neither young nor old, but somehow ancient and patient beyond human comprehension. "It grows beneath," the voice whispers. "It rises within. And we are eternal." Arwib Mayor